This session is titled Safeguarding Freedom of Expression. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights includes freedom of expression, yet freedom of speech is continuously under threat. The criminalisation of free expression attempts to regulate the media, campus codes of conduct, speech codes and attempts at censorships, and that's not ancient history, it's clearly alive and well today. So the question we're posing here today is, how do we safeguard expression? And I'd like to introduce our panel members. To my right, we have Professor Joseph Siracusa, the Deputy Dean in Global and Language Studies from Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT, and welcome, Joe. Joe has actually had 48 hours notice of his attendance as he's replacing Jeannie Ree. He's a fellow CHASS board member. We then have, next to us is Tim Wilson, the Australian Human Rights Commissioner, followed by John Roskam, the Executive Director of Institute of Public Affairs, and Emma Bennison, the Chief Executive Officer of Arts Access Australia. So the intention of this session is a conversation. I'll be posing some questions to them, but I would also welcome your input and conversations right from the outset. So there will be a microphone coming round. And I ask that you might stand up, please, because the cameras aren't able to catch you if you're sitting down, should you wish to be filmed for prosperity. So I'll start with an opening question to each of you. That is, how do we safeguard our free expression? Joe?
Oh, I get to go first. By the way, I'm not a former member of the CHASS. I'm secretary right now.
Oh, congratulations. Oh, sorry.
So, you know,
Mr. Secretary.
Yeah, you know. Now, safeguarding, I got this assignment about 48 hours ago, and though I've been here 40 years as an American, I'm very excited to talk about freedom of expression. It's guaranteed in the First Amendment of the United States. 8 years after the Founding Fathers penned that phrase, John Adams then signed the Alien Sedition Laws, and threw immigrants out of the country, imprisoned people. People went to jail for disagreeing with his comments on foreign policy. In a way, Americans have been a little schizophrenic about their thing. And then Oliver Wendell Holmes, in the famous Schenck case, said something like, there's no permanent guarantee because you can't shout fire in a theater, which was just a sidebar to his ruling, which sent some poor bastard to jail for 5 years for peaceful dissent against the First World War, followed then by Eugene Debs, another member of the Socialist Party. Now, I grew up in a family that was very sensitive to freedom of expression. My grandfather was an anarchist from Sicily. I grew up during the McCarthy Army hearings, so that was my first thing on television. I got to see Joe McCarthy challenging people's opinions. And then I also grew up in a period of anti-communism where my first grade teacher had to sign a statement that she was not and has never been a member of the Communist Party of America, and that she does not advocate the overthrow of the United States. So people's opinions were, they were under scrutiny the entire time I was growing up. And then when I went to high school, I tried to fight freedom of expression a little bit. My first book review assignment was Jack London's Called the Wild, so I went to Barnes & Noble to buy it, and I bought Henry Miller's Tropic of Cancer instead, because it said unexpurgated version, and they used all these words that they used on the south side of Chicago, so I felt very resonant with this, so I wrote a review, and my headmaster called me in and asked me how long I wanted to stay in high school. So I cut that out, but in 1969, the Supreme Court overthrew the Schenck hearing of 1917-18 and declared, the court held that inflammatory speech and even speech advocating violence by members of the Klan is protected under the First Amendment, unless, and this is the operative word and the word that I would use today, unless that speech is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. And this is usually referred to in a time of clear and present danger, that is when nations are at war. And much of this is left up to the community to decide where you cross the line and where you don't cross the line. Societies, particularly the hate crimes, have been prohibited in all kinds of developed countries, but you can't take it too far. You can't say The French wanted you to say that had a law that says that you could not deny the Armenian massacre, and that was thrown out by the Human Rights Commission because that's going too far. So it's this balance thing. At the same time, censorship and free expression, to me, is about how we deal with governments and how governments deal with us. And I think the politicians, they don't always get it. They don't know why they don't get it. And I've always been motivated all my life by a famous line written by some guy at Crimson in 1917 who said that politicians don't mean badly when they talk about these things. Walter Lippmann says most of the time they don't mean anything at all. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Emma. Would you like to tackle the opening statement there about how we safeguard expression?
Sure. I would say that, speaking from an arts and disability perspective, I should just say that Arts Access Australia is the national peak body for arts and disability, just in case people aren't aware of that. And I guess from my perspective as an artist with disability, I think it's really important to safeguard freedom of expression, because I think as people with disability, we have historically been subjected to what we term as a medicalised model of disability. And what that can mean, and has meant historically, is sometimes that the voices that are heard around people with disability are not their voices, or not our voices, I should say, because I am actually one of them. But also, but generally the voices of people who are so-called experts about what we need and what we would like to say. And really interesting story that illustrates how this can be problematic is, I remember I did some work with a festival in the Asia Pacific. It was called the Wataboshi Music Festival. It began in Japan in about 1997, and it began because a Japanese journalist was going around the country and he was talking to families of people with disability, and he was struck by the fact that he never actually heard their voices. He kept hearing from parents, he heard from carers, he heard from doctors, he heard from therapists. He never actually heard the voices of people with disability. So he decided to set up this festival. Now you might say, well, that's not that exciting. But in Japan, remembering that we're talking about, nearly 20 years ago, that was a pretty massive undertaking. And what was even more incredible about that was that he managed to bring delegations from across the Asia Pacific region to contribute to that festival. Now that's a really strong mobilisation of freedom of expression by people with disability. And unfortunately, you might say, well, I'm sure that happens often in Australia. Unfortunately, it doesn't happen often enough. I mean, we've just seen the cessation of ABC Ramp Up, for example, which is the disability opinion website, which the ABC has just cut. And I mean, I think that in itself is an interesting example of how freedom of expression is actually being censored now. You could say, well, it'll come up somewhere else, someone else will take it up. But I don't think we can underestimate the importance of the voices of marginalised people, whether it be people with disability or other minority groups, actually being supported by our major media organisations. And we've only got to look at the Mental As campaign that's happening at the moment on the ABC to see a really strong example of how that can work well. So, I mean, I think there is a lot of good stuff happening, but I think it is really, really important that we remain vigilant about freedom of expression, because we know that, the arts is a very powerful tool for getting beyond the rhetoric and actually talking about how we as human beings interact with each other and what sort of a society. I think they reflect what sort of a society we are, or what sort of a society we might wish we could be or want to be in the future. And so I think, that's why it is very important that it's not just the loudest voices or the voices that people are ready to hear or feel comfortable hearing that are being heard. I think it's very important that there's a broader range of voices being heard through whatever form of expression we choose to use. So,
thank you, Emma. Excellent. John?
Thank you. As was mentioned, freedom of speech is never permanently safeguarded. Freedom of speech is a licence, is an allowance that the community gives to itself and gives to the members of the community. And it was raised, the question is, if we want to safeguard freedom of speech, who safeguards it? Ultimately, I believe it's the community and its convention and it is practice and it is understanding. Freedom of speech is not safeguarded by the Supreme Court in the US or the High Court in Australia or by our politicians. There are a few ways that we don't safeguard freedom of speech. We don't safeguard freedom of speech by saying that we defend the right of Julian Assange to publish what he wants, or Snowden to publish what he wants, or a journalist to investigate ASIO without the threat of 10 years jail. We don't say that those people should have freedom of speech, but Andrew Bolt should not. I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the debate about freedom of speech is that the left in Australia, or much of the left in Australia, hates Andrew Bolt more than they like freedom of speech. And I've been struck by the lack of voices that until relatively recently have been raised on the freedom of speech argument, because there have been many people who say that race hate should not be allowed, and we can have a discussion about what race hate is and so on. But at the same time, we need an untrammelled right to investigate government misfeasance. Absolutely, we do. But we don't pick and choose when freedom of speech applies. And the Institute of Public Affairs was fortunate enough to have Professor Ferruti speak to us on Monday night. And the professor said very powerfully, you can't pick and choose. And I think we are losing the freedom of speech debate when all of us on the left, on the right, on the middle tend to pick and choose.
Tim, thank you, John. Where do you stand on that, Tim?
Well, it is one adds something to the discussion already. I think what we need to do is understand what we mean by free speech, because we've actually had very different opinions already on the panel so far. Because there are people like me, and I imagine John's very much in this camp, which freedom of speech is fundamentally about the right of the individual to express themselves without restrictions by government about what you can say and do so long as you don't achieve the objectives that were set out before by the professor with relation to incitement to violence or something akin to that. Then we've had another discussion point about how platforms are the same as free speech, and denying somebody platform is a form of censorship, which I don't subscribe to as a very different proposition. That's an argument to me not for free speech, it's an argument for fair speech. And I actually don't think it's a good argument or a good construct to discuss free speech in, because it's ultimately not a discussion so much about rights as is about issues of social justice and issues of democratic participation, which has a rights-based dimension to it, but it's not a good box or framework to do so. Because the reality is there is no perfect preservation if you look at preserving and protecting the right of the individual to express themselves that can guarantee it. It predominantly exists within a lived culture of a society. Because if you just rely on courts, or you just rely on the Constitution, or you rely on the Parliament, what you end up doing is handing over control about an attitude at a particular period of time. They may help or assist, as I think broadly speaking the US Supreme Court probably does, certainly in comparison to the absence of something like that in Australia. But lived culture is just as important, because that's what stops not just the politicians or others seeking to restrict what people can say. It's when other people stand up and speak out in defence of a principle, even if they don't agree with what is being said, which John has already highlighted is one of the perennial problems. And the classic example is with the discussion we're having right now. When the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was negotiated, Eleanor Roosevelt specifically railed against the idea there should be restrictions on free speech on things which are called racial hatred. And the reason was because it was too loose a language. It was being pushed by the USSR to justify try and balance up, generally speaking, issues around race and what people can say in terms of public speech. But it was too loose a language, and she opposed it there, and ultimately was excluded from the Universal Declaration. Then we got to the negotiations of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and she lost out. Now, using a term like hatred, which is a very broad term indeed, has huge problems to justify restrictions of free speech. We've seen that, of course, in our recent debate around the Racial Discrimination Act, which directly correlates to the example I gave. But it's exactly the same argument the Prime Minister is using today, and exactly the same people who opposed me on 18C are now saying, why am I not speaking out harder against the proposition the Prime Minister is putting forward, where somebody who gets up and advocates that there is a problem as far as they're concerned with US-based or US-led strikes in Iraq and Syria is now some form of racial hatred or hatred against the state. And I think that's a really big problem, because this is what happens when you establish very loose terms, and people need to be prepared to stand up and speak out about why this is a real problem, and you have to approach free speech always from a principle-based perspective, because exactly as John said, and obviously Frank said as well, you can't pick and choose.
So if lived culture is our guiding principle in relation to freedom of expression.
Well, it's not the only one, but it's a very important one.
Where do we get the moral underpinning philosophy that will, direct, I guess, where right and wrong sits as such? I'm sorry, I shouldn't use right and wrong, but so where do you think, Tim, the actual code of conduct of moral philosophy comes from?
Well, I think when we look at something like free speech, you have to start with a blank canvas, and all speech is legal until it's made explicitly illegal. Now, law is a very bad way of trying to regulate speech. Of course, when it amounts to pronouncing towards a criminal act, which can harm somebody else, then it's relatively straightforward, at least to use law as a mechanism to enforce punishment. But what we massively undervalue in terms of regulation of speech is the informal ways we regulate it. Now, people have their own views about different methods, but Adam Smith said in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that people regulate their conduct largely by by the wish to be held in good standing of their peers. And it's the informal mechanisms that do a much better job on a day-to-day basis of making sure that we exercise a degree of respect for others. And you can say all the way from me knowing there are certain words that I can use at the pub but I can't use in front of my parents, which have never been discussed, but nonetheless we know that there are some words that I will not use in those depending on the context, all the way to much more formal ones where we know full well that they're in a business environment engaging in certain types of speech is considered inappropriate. And then, of course, some people seek to formalise those in terms of code of conduct or other instruments, which don't stop you saying something, it just attaches consequences to it, but isn't, like law, a mechanism for censorship. So where do these things come from? They come from the very cultural norms that exist within our society and help inform making sure we exercise our behaviour in an appropriate and responsible way.
So I'm understanding that cultural norms come from society and need to be informally regulated as such by
Well, when
society.
we're talking about something like speech, I think the answer is absolutely yes, because anything else amounts to censorship. But it doesn't mean that we can't have standards that we expect other people to meet. But there's a big difference between using the arm of the state to achieve them and me standing up and speaking out if you say something that I find outrageous or offensive or disgraceful or hateful. As its own form of measuring and regulating what people do.
Let's talk about offensive on that, Joe. What do you think about how and which people are offended, and whether or not there is any need to discuss more openly, I think, what happens when somebody is offended?
Well, when I think of free speech, I'm thinking here of the criminalization of free speech. I'm thinking of government censoring people and sending them to jail. But we live in a very politically correct time, and with apologies to some people who have heard this story, I was watching some SBS accounting of a sports event, a soccer match, and somebody called the Mexican team a bunch of nachos. And my wife, who doesn't even like soccer, sent an email to SBS. She got a response on Monday, and then 30 days later, she got a formal apology from the chairman of SBS apologizing for the bad behavior on air and how it offended the Mexican people. She doesn't even like soccer, and I told her to mind her own business. But we live in an age where people are particularly offended. Yeah. You know, when I'm talking about censorship, I'm talking about some poor bastard who goes to jail for not answering Tony Fitzgerald's questions at the inquiry, or somebody who goes to jail in 1917 for opposing a war. And I like the courts here because this is our last refuge. You know, if the courts don't agree with us because it is a clear and present danger, then we're going to go to jail. So I'm not worried about the informal thing. I'm not worried about defamation liability or libel laws. I mean, that's in the private domain, how we behave in the pub and elsewhere. But I think we live in a very highly sensitive time where everything is sort of regarded as a challenge to sensitivity and free speech. So I think we should, I'm looking for the narrow definition. I want to know when a government can clobber an individual for saying what's on his mind.
John, are we walking a fine line in relation to the government's ability to determine where that line is and what effect offence has on people?
The point is exactly that's been raised, which is in the private sphere, I think you should be able to complain about offence. You should be able to claim recompense in some way. Offence is absolutely something that is real and tangible to the person who has felt offence. But that is entirely different from the state saying it should be unlawful. And this is the broader question that we face, which is things that are legitimately in the private domain are now becoming within the realm of the state. And this is why Senator Bob Day's amendments to Section 18C of the Racial Discrimination Act that are currently before the Senate now, seeking to take out the words offend and insult from the current law, to no longer make it lawful, to no longer have it unlawful to say something on the basis of someone's race or ethnicity if they're offended or insulted. Intimidated is something different. Humiliated is a 50-50 word. But I think offence and insult are vague, amorphous terms. They are real, but they are within the private domain. If you don't want to go to a shop that whose owners have a particular social viewpoint and you're offended by their viewpoint, then you shouldn't need to shop at that shop, and nothing should stop you doing that.
What about the public domain that is supported by the government, such as in the arts? What if you are offended?
Well, that means you'd have to support government spending on the arts anyway. So I'll just chuck that out there for a group like this.
Actually, we're not even going down that route. Don't be like that.
Yeah.
My question is, what then happens where it's not in the pub, it's not in the private domain, it is actually in the public domain?
Well, this raises a broader question. I'm not sure. This is one of the reasons why I don't like government funding of the arts, why I don't like government funding of sport, why I don't like government funding of civil society, because it turns the private domain into the public domain. And I know this is not a debate about civil society, and I know this is not a debate about the government funding the ASADA and their investigation into Essendon. But if we look at the creeping realm of the state into NGOs, into the third sector, into civil society, we have a big, big problem. And I think you're right, it probably does. If something is funded by the state and then transposes into the private sector and private sphere, I think then you do have a problem. I don't know what the answer is, but it does allow me to have spoken for the last minute on a real concern that I have, which is the diminishing private space.
I think you've probably made anyway, a couple of people raise their eyebrows, no doubt, in this friendly neck of the woods. There's actually a question from the floor, and I do want to open it up straight away. Could I have a microphone over to Robert Fidian, please? Emma, I'll come back to you in a minute on that, but first let's see, I think, in relation to the heavy issues we have.
Robert Fidian, I would just want to maybe chuck in another layer of complexity. We've been talking very simply in terms of public and private, and John, you were just beginning to talk about different sorts of limits. I've done a lot of work with political cartoonists. They know very well what they can do legally, what they can do in terms of politicians. They can do anything to politicians. The thing that the area that they're not sure about, that I think is another creeping form of censorship, is actually in the last decade or two has been corporate censorship. The censorship of large organisations, which may be in your framework of private, that exert a degree of discipline. And I know corporations legally are persons and so on, but it seems to me that's in these discussions, that's a force for limiting freedom of speech.
Sorry, can you clarify? Do you mean by in terms of threatening lawsuits?
Threatening lawsuits, and indeed also disciplining their own members, their own employees from speaking out. Those are probably the two things, and I honestly don't know that there's a simple answer to that. That's not as simple, but I think that is another limitation that has been creeping in.
Would you like to tackle that, Tim?
Oh, sure. It's not, to me, it's not a straightforward question to answer. There is a difference, of course, between what happens in the public square with relation to private employees versus public employees. Earlier this year, there was a huge kerfuffle because the federal government introduced a new social media policy which said that if you work for a government department in the federal government, you couldn't engage in discussion in the public square if it, unnecessarily derided the parliament or an individual member of parliament or a particular policy. People got very upset, but it was actually exactly the same policy that existed for any other type of comment. It's just that it creeped into social media for the first time and gave clarity that it applied not just to you going to a media outlet and saying, my name's Tim Wilson, I work for, the Department of Finance, and I think the Minister of Finance is an expletive. It just says you can't do this for the minister on social media as well. And how you draw the line on that, and I think it's very important, is challenging because, of course, particularly when it's the government, it amounts to potentially censoring legitimate opinion. And I actually don't think the guidelines are too far out of getting it right, because it says you can be critical of government, but you can't do it in an unnecessarily hostile way, which would demean the standard of the public service. But when you're in the private sphere, it's a bit more different because, of course, you choose to work for a private company and you accept the standards of your employment when you go and work for them. And if you don't like them, of course, you can leave and go into a different environment. Now, that, of course, does limit what people can say if they wish to remain employed. But the requirement is if they wish to remain employed. They don't have to remain employed if they don't want to. They can go to a different work environment. Some people see that as censorship. I don't see that as censorship.
Thank you, Tim. I think clearly, there is another question from the floor over there. Have you still got that question? Okay, I'll come to you. But in the meantime, Emma, I'd like to give you a voice in this, obviously. Who, aside from what Tim and John are saying here, who do you think we are accountable to as such in relation to the freedom of expression?
Well, can I just pick up something else before I answer that question? Sorry. Just wanted to pick up on the comment that was made before by Tim, I think it was, about how we need to distinguish between, freedom of speech and social justice platforms, I think was the word you used. And I would argue that the two are inextricably linked. And the reason, I know you won't agree with me, so I'm not trying to convince you, I'm just talking generally. But I think they are inextricably linked. And the reason I say that is because you can have all the freedom of speech you like. I can go out and, speak to anyone on the street corner or whatever. But if the right people aren't listening, and if you're not able to actually speak at the level that you need to in order to actually make that point widely known or, share that particular point of view, then, freedom of speech can actually be pointless. So to say that, it's not, the two are not the same and it's very different propositions, I think is really missing an important point. I mean, I just returned from a visit to the UK and I was looking at disability leadership, but at the same time I also went to a festival called Unlimited. It's a disability arts festival, and it's government funded, I'm sorry to say. But
Don't ever apologise for that.
I'm not apologising for it. I'm just apologising that you won't find it palatable. But the point about that's really important is that it was held in the South Bank Centre, so that's a very significant UK, London venue. It was seen by thousands and thousands and thousands of people, and a very diverse audience. And nobody can ever convince me that wasn't an important opportunity for a diverse range of people to see really high quality, accessible work by artists with disability that normally happens, in the back rooms of, small theatres, if it gets seen at all. So my point is that unless there's a platform and unless there's a will from society to actually embrace the expression that people want to make, then it's a pointless waste of time having freedom. You can have all the laws in the world. You can have all the safeguards in the world. If nobody's ready to listen, and if there's not the platform and not the will of society and the moral compass within society to say that that's an important, conversation that we need to have, then I don't see the point. You need both. It's absolutely critical.
Yes, sure, John.
Just on that, I think it raises a really important point that comes to the question, the difference between freedom of speech and fair speech. I don't think fair speech exists. Fair speech is a completely subjective notion against which there is no measure. And I think it is very complicated to confuse the two, and we are doing it. I have a very thin conception of freedom of speech, which is simply, does the state make it unlawful? And I know that sometimes we try and conflate the two for a whole series of purposes, but I think certainly the difference between me and Emma is we would have fundamentally different views on the conjunction between fairness and platform and space and reach, and simply is saying something unlawful.
Do you believe that our culture, the Australian culture, is to have a fair go?
What does that mean?
Well, that's what I'm wondering, if you know what that means.
I don't know what it means. I run a free market think tank. I don't think.
So how many? Sorry, can I ask you a question? And I'm really not.
No.
I'm not asking this to be difficult. I'm really genuinely asking the question: how many people with disability are in your think tank? How many people?
I've never classed anyone at the IPA as having a disability or not.
It's a question because what kind of diversity of views are you getting? I'm not saying you're not. I'm just asking the question. What level of diversity are you getting, and how is that supporting freedom of speech? Because I'm trying to stay up.
Oh, no, look, and I think that's a really good question and good discussion for today. I take an ultimate free market view on employment. If you as an employer are going to discriminate against anyone on the basis of their race or gender or having a disability, then you are engaging in a self-harming activity that is by definition not efficient, because you are not hiring the very best person for the job.
Can I just make a quick comment, which is, firstly I need to clarify, I didn't say that it wasn't important to make sure people have platforms. I just said I don't think you should conflate the two. And it's very important, reason why is because it diminishes the standing and the issues of both. I mean, as Human Rights Commissioner, one of my perpetual frustrations is that people seem to think everything is a human right, and it seems to reach on every different aspect, which means human rights mean nothing. And that's what they mean in this country today. They mean nothing. If they don't have some degree of integrity, and we actually say this is a human rights issue and this is a social justice issue, and it diminishes both by treating them as just interchangeable. There are overlaps, I don't disagree with that, but they are not the same thing. But I would actually argue that the idea of fair speech is actually extremely dangerous. The idea that we class people as individuals, then we class people based on different aspects of their identity or how they choose, then we decide in what order they can speak, the amount of voice they can have, is a recipe for silencing people, censoring people. And I experienced this at university. There used to be a thing at university, it may still exist, where students at a conference called Queer Collaborations, which is basically a LGBTI, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex conference, and everybody would get proportionate position on a speaking list as frequent based on their gender, their everything else, blah, blah, and it basically worked to people being classed and some people being silent. So in the end, there was some people who were just completely denied their free speech on this basis. Some people were given a bigger voice, even if they had nothing relevant to say.
Sure. Look, we've got quite a few questions from the floor now. I won't let you answer this, but I just want to wonder what you think about the mob mentality. What happens when, individuals' voices aren't heard and when things roll into a mob? But we won't go there now. Can I please have your question?
Certainly. My name's Janice Dudley and I'm from Murdoch University in Western Australia. My question is about the relationship between freedom of expression and academic freedom. In our modern Western understandings of university, academic freedom is central to their role as loyal critics of society and loyal critics of government and critics of power. So I'd be interested in the panel's views on academic freedom. Is it the same as standard individual freedom of expression, which we've been talking about to date? And secondly, I'd be interested to know whether individual members of the panel think there should be any limits on academic freedom, and if so, what these might be.
Who's going to tackle that one?
Well, I'm an academic, I should say something here. Academic freedom, of course, is an evolution of a principle that evolved in the 14th century from Bologna, where academics could go anywhere they want with a passport. They were free to go. And so that's devolved into sort of the freedom to go anywhere, the freedom to say everything. Now, every university has a sense of what academic freedom is. It is to do research and ask difficult questions, but as long as they're not offensive, we don't go looking for racial theories or euthanasia or that kind of thing. We sort of govern ourselves. We don't allow a member of staff to look at the sexual practices of aliens in the Anthropocene era or something like that. I mean, we have common sense. Now, freedom of expression is only limited to me by the courts and by community, or maybe the community standards. I mean, we can't watch a man on television have his throat cut because that's not in good taste, but the next frame on SBS is a drone going up some exhaust pipe of some guy in a pickup truck, watching it being blown to smithereens, and I'm thinking, this is the self-censorship on behalf of these networks. They don't want to show us the blood, but we can see the sort of the clean version of the drone going up an exhaust pipe. I don't think freedom of expression and academic freedom are the same things. Freedom of expression is limited by community standards. Academics have different standards. We are peer-reviewed. We control each other, so to speak. And frankly, we answer to a higher standard. We just can't have a member of staff who's an expert on bugs writing an expose about governments. I mean, he has to be within his area or her area of expertise. So we're sort of self-governing. But I don't think the two of them are the same thing.
Okay. John, would you like to suggest where you think those limitations might be for academia or not?
Have I said enough controversial things already? I can go a bit further.
Keep going.
No, what do we mean? Key question, what do we mean by academic freedom? I'm not sure that academics should have any more freedom or less freedom than any member of the community. Academic freedom to me is the laws that apply to any other individual that might make something unlawful. Unfortunately, I think many people mean academic freedom is academics being funded by the state to do whatever they want. Now, that's the trade-off. You're funded by the state. You're funded by taxes. Now, 45%. Oh, so no, well, exactly. But I think you raise a key point. That is the trade-off that we make. But in terms of academic freedom, I think anyone funded privately should be able to do anything they want within the limits of the law. But academic freedom in Australia transcends into, well, does the Minister for Education get to tick off an ARC grants? Now, arguably, he or she should. Who decides how taxpayers' funding is to be spent? I think really key question.
Two things. I'm trying to choose which one. I'll choose one of them. This gets back to Tim's earlier comments about the particular standards of the society at a particular time. If we were having this discussion 30, 40 years ago, it would be all about obscenity. Because that was the major thing that the state was censoring. It was obscenity and arguments about whether James Joyce was obscene and various other books and cinema and so on. It's no longer about that. No one's mentioned it. No one cares. It's not an issue, is it?
No, I wouldn't quite agree with that, but anyway.
Well, it's evolved.
Yeah.
And somehow it's managed to do it in some mysterious way that didn't require any government control, that didn't require anybody to make any decisions. The standards of the community moved on and everything else moved on with it. And so really you can have social change without actually having a social changer, if you know what I mean. And this seems to be a good example of it. I don't know whether anyone would like to comment on that, but can I just add one more thing? Being at a university, being a member of this university, people are allowed any opinion that they want. And people are free within the limits that have been described to say whatever they like on any subject they like. So you can believe the world is flat. That's fine. Go around telling everyone the world. But we are not obligated to give you the chair of geography. There is a big difference between a platform and an opinion. I am happy for you to have whatever your opinion is, but we can manage to make our choices here on other grounds. But obscenity is the one that I think illustrates Tim's point.
We'll take a question over here now. Actually, where is the microphone? Right at the back, please, and then I'll come to you.
My name's Marcella Pillane. I'd just like to bring back the discussion to lived experience, which was mentioned earlier, and it seems to me that the balance of freedom of speech should be, in my mind, against the human right, and I will use that term regardless, of the individual's right to live in peace. And this seems to me to be something that the conversation has been missing, and I think is missing more broadly in the community. There is also another issue, I think, here, that we and I'm an academic too, we occupy a very privileged position. And denialism of other people's stories, we're a very multicultural society, it's not really reflected here, is, according to sociologists and the wider community, a re-traumatisation. And this is a conversation I think Australia has to have, and I would like to ask the panel to comment on that, if they can. For example, the Armenian massacre was mentioned in the opening comments.
Genocide.
I'm a third-generation Armenian genocide survivor, and the Armenian genocide is also a research interest. I'd just like to make mention that using the term Armenian massacre rather than Armenian genocide is also buying into the denialist speech. So thank you for that.
Emma, would you like to make comment on that about,
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that I think we do have to be very mindful of people's stories. And I think that's, we've talked a lot about the laws surrounding freedom of speech, but I just think the discussion is missing the fundamental point that freedom of speech is actually about people having the right to, to share their experiences of the world, because that's actually how we learn. But I would come back to the fact that people actually do need to be encouraged and supported, both in terms of telling those stories but also building audiences for them, because I don't think it's just a build it and they will come kind of scenario. I think there does have to be support, and this is one of the reasons why, of course, I would strongly support public funding for the arts. There does have to be an opportunity for audiences to be built for some of that work, particularly work that the people aren't necessarily used to seeing, ready to see. There's a whole lot of complexity around it. It's not as simple as saying, well, the law says that we can speak on whatever we like, and then, private decisions can be made about whether people will get a platform. It's not quite that black and white for me. I think people, in order for us to have social change, real social change over a period of time, there needs to be a strong support mechanism for people whose stories don't traditionally get heard, to have those stories heard in a way that doesn't diminish them and actually strengthens those people's opportunity to contribute to society. Because there are a lot of people who you might say legally have freedom of speech, but that doesn't mean that they actually have freedom of speech in a social sense. So I think it's really important, an important distinction.
Would you like to comment on that, Tim?
Well, I mean, I agree that people's lived stories are actually incredibly important, particularly if you want to drive social change, because there are hegemonic groups within society, people with more power, people with less power, people with more voice, people with less voice. This is not in dispute, I suspect, by anybody, and part of the way you change that is actually through exposure and relationships, particularly to those people who come from minority sections of the community and understand their situation, understand why the consequences of their experience affects their participation. I'm not disputing that even for a second. I actually think it's very good to provide platforms for groups within the community who may not have as much of a voice. I just don't see that as a free speech issue, because it isn't a free speech issue, it's a platform issue, and that's something that's much more about a sense of justice in society and isn't actually well constructed to be discussed as a right, because if it does, it necessarily negates other rights very, very quickly.
Where in our society, or where can we safeguard the platform?
Well, platforms come in lots of different forms, and so they can come from private philanthropy, they can come from individuals who prosecute their argument successfully and other people provide them for them. They can be provided, despite what people's views may be, they can actually be provided by a government. How they should be provided and how much is a debatable point, but they can be provided by lots of different avenues to do so. Now, how much they should be provided and by whom is a legitimate area of public policy debate, and a very important public part of debate in terms of how we achieve a more just society, but it is an extension of rights.
So it does
Human
come
rights,
back to public policy at the end in your
platforms.
argument? Yeah.
Of course it can, but
Okay.
once you start silencing somebody because you think they've got too much of a platform and you want to apportion it to somebody else, you're amounting to silencing or censoring somebody.
I'm going to take a question over here.
Yeah, it's Trevor Hogan from La Trobe University. I want to follow up on the question that was asked from Murdoch University over here. We've heard all the panellists talk about public and private, state, civil society, and this is the university's forum, and we've got the branding of the University of Melbourne here. We've got the Australian Government Department of Industry sponsorship. Is the university a private or a public institution? And what is the role of the institutions? Because we're not hearing much about what instituted forms of public life not only safeguard the freedom of expression, but practice it, so that we're developing arguments and having arguments about what the good society is and what our rights are vis-a-vis the state. By the way, John, as a side comment, delighted that you mentioned taxpayers. Is the IPA going to start a campaign to get the top 100 corporations in Australia to pay their tax? Joe Hockey would be very appreciative to fix up his deficit problem.
I'll take that as a comment. Joy, would you like to make comment on universities being
The
private or
legal
public?
position. We got vice chancellors in the room who know exactly the answer to this one. I'm not a lawyer. I haven't talked to the university solicitor, but essentially we act like a corporation, but we're a non-profit organization, so we're sort of in no man's land there. I think that would be better for a vice chancellor to answer. The room's filled with people who are executives and vice chancellors.
Is there anyone who would like to tackle that, a vice chancellor there?
Well, the University of Melbourne is established by Act of Parliament. It's a public institution. It may not get all of its funding from it, but it's a public institution. Yeah.
There you go.
That's a pretty straightforward question.
Okay. There's a question over here from Dr. Yep, right at the front here. Oh, sorry, that's you, Frank.
Thanks very much. I thought Emma made a very important point, which I think is really at the nub of the debate and the problems to do with freedom, which is, she said that freedom is pointless unless, presumably, you can act on it, or you can you can really use it to gain social justice. And I think that sentiment is very widespread in the Western world, where the difference between the kind of life you want and real freedom are conflated. You know, they exist on the same level. Basically, and there's a lot of truth in that, because as we all know, the freedom of speech of somebody that runs the Australian is considerably more formidable than Emma's or anybody else on that platform. And we all know that there are people with more power than others who are able to exercise and act on freedoms in the way that you and I cannot. And we also know from history that freedoms are often bits of paper. They look really brilliant, but they don't really give us the resources to do very much. We know that, and we can draw one of two conclusions. We can either say they're pointless, they're just a piece of paper, let's get something else, or we could react in the way I think we should, which is to say that freedoms are logically prior to the running of a democratic progressive society. And that unless we have those freedoms, unless we take those freedoms really, really seriously, precisely by those people who haven't got very much power, then I think our life overall will be very much undermined. And I think it's for that reason it's very important not to ever use the word pointless with freedoms, because even the thinnest freedom, which only has the most minimal reality, has got a point to it. And the point is that we've got to learn to act on it. I think we shouldn't confuse the fact that we haven't got the power with the need to have the freedom to gain power. And I think what history shows is that when people take freedom seriously, even people with fairly minimal economic resources, when they live the life of freedom, when they acclaim freedom, then something wonderful begins to happen within society itself. It creates a different dynamic and a different vibrance. And I think, to me, the biggest threat to freedom today is not the government, it's not dictators and totalitarian regimes, it's the lack of cultural valuation for freedom. It's the idea it's pointless.
Yes.
I think that is what we're kind of concerned about. When you talk to people, freedom is not a big deal, so what? It's when you take it for granted. It's when you basically say, oh yeah, it's interesting, but actually, social justice is much more important, or this is much more important. I think that's really something that we need to think about, because if we have that cavalier attitude towards freedoms, then it does become pointless. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Thank you. Did you want to say something, John? No. All right. There's another question just over here, please, and then I'll take one more and give everyone a moment to wrap up.
Elizabeth Coleman from Monash University. I wanted to preface this with a couple of points. There's been a suggestion that, in fact, there's some kind of increase in regulation of the public sphere, or increase in regulation of what we're allowed to say in relation to hate speech. On one level, you might want to say that the public space, or our public citizens, have always had public nuisance laws. You still can't use obscene language or blaspheme legally on trains, buses, in public spaces. We have always regulated media in terms of who's going to be watching it, at what time, and appropriateness. So we have always regulated speech. There has not been, it seems, a decrease or an increase in the regulation of speech. There has been a decrease. There's a decrease in the emphasis on obscenity and blasphemy laws. So my question is simply, when people sort of say, no, we are no longer worried so much about religious sensibilities, what we are worried about is whether or not all people feel comfortable within the society, or social inclusiveness. All that means is that there has been a change in the nature of regulation, not that we are regulating speech more or less.
Joe, do you have any comment on that?
No, I think you're right. And every society, but the first condition of free speech is the free marketplace of ideas. I'm sure freedom was talked about in Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, Stalinist Russia, Cambodia, bad times. where they talked about freedom, whatever kind of freedom they're talking about. But in the marketplace of ideas, which is in tandem with freedom of expression, they will drive that crap idea out of the marketplace. That's why freedom of expression is important, for people to have a chance. I remember seeing a great documentary on the end of the Cold War, and they had all these kids at the wall on November 8, 1989, and they said to this young couple, what was there about the West that you wanted? And they, what gave you this sense of resisting? And they said they could feel the freedom of the West in the rock and roll lyrics that they heard on their radios and on their discs and all the rest of it. And I thought about that for a long time. It was just the freedom to sing or do whatever the hell you want to do, which is going to drive the bad ideas out. But this idea of live, that is, the climate of opinion. We live in a very different climate of opinion, and we always have to be vigilant about who's taking control of these things. But you're right, it's about the regulation. And when Stephen says that we don't think much more about obscenity or regulation of obscenity, I guess that's what drove me to Henry Miller in the first place. It looked awfully good read.
John?
I'd argue that, in fact, regulation has increased. So, for example, the interpretation in the Bolt case did change the law. The broader point that you mentioned in the earlier question about the right to live in peace, the right to live comfortably, balanced up against the right to freedom of speech. Well, no, but the idea that people should be able to be comfortable, and the idea that the right to freedom of speech needs to be balanced perhaps against the right to live in peace. No, not you, but earlier. If the right to freedom of speech is balanced against, let's say, the right to live in peace, which, as you said, you didn't use, but let's take that as a term, then there's no such thing as the right to freedom of speech. I'm a Christian. I'm a member of the Liberal Party. Every time someone has a go at Tony Abbott wearing his budgie smugglers, I'm offended. I feel a little bit less...
There are some other people
like
offended
living,
at that
like
too.
living in peace. Exactly. Even that comment.
Yeah, sorry.
So, that is part of living in civil society. We can go and live in the middle of nowhere. But if freedoms come at a cost sometimes. So I don't think, coming back to the question about the right to live in peace, if we privilege the right to live in peace, then there's not going to be much discussion about anything. Nicola Roxon, as the Attorney General, who I was at law school with at this university, in fact attempted to embed the right to live in peace in a way when she introduced amendments to the Human Rights and Anti-Discrimination legislation, where she said, and it was proposed, that it would be unlawful to insult or offend someone on the basis of their social origin or their religion.
Political opinion.
And or their political opinion. Now, that I can absolutely understand that was an attempt to have people live in peace, but that came at the price of freedom of speech.
I'm going to ask one last question, and we're on time now, to Tim. I understand the President of the Human Rights Commission, Ms. Gillian Triggs, is actually interested, or I understand there's consultation on at the moment in 2014 around the country, and that she has commented on needing, personally wanting at least, a legislated human rights charter. She said she wanted an agreement on the principles in which we would, which are fair to our community. What is happening with that?
Well, any consultations being run at the moment around the country are being run by me. So, I'm not actually aware of her saying that. So I'm sort of surprised by it. So I'm not sure when it became about, or if it did, it was never reported to me. Because the reality is there's zero political appetite for a human rights charter at a federal level. And people can have their own views about whether they think it's right or wrong. But the previous government looked at it, decided not to do it. The current government, I can say with confidence, won't look at it and won't do it. And so I think it's completely and utterly dead in the water.
That's that then.
Yeah.
Well, as is this conversation. Emma, would you like to have any final wrap-up comment, Emma?
Only to say that I think that it's really important to consider when we're talking about freedom of expression that everybody needs to be included, and you can't, as you said, somebody said before, you can't pick and choose. Everybody has that right, and I think it's really important that we do continue to be vigilant about safeguarding it.
Thank you. Well, let me thank Emma Bennison, Professor Joe, I can never say your surname.
Siracusa.
Siracusa, beg your pardon. John Roskam and Tim Wilson. Please thank them for me.